Hello, I am Dale Campbell for DIYPhotography.net, and this is a review of the Accsoon Toprig S60 motorized slider. Now this to some extent also goes for the Toprig S40 slider. It's the same mechanism, the slider looks identical apart from the fact it is just slightly shorter. So one is 60 centimeters, one is 40 centimeters. The 60 centimeter for me seemed like the most sensible length, 40 just seemed very short, but I can see that if you wanted something which was very much more travel focused, a little bit more nimble, pack downable, then that would perhaps be the more suitable one to go for. First things first, you should also know that Accsoon have sent this out for review, and that does mean that obviously we are getting this for free. Now that shouldn't affect any of the details that I'm about to talk you through, but you might want to take the review with that pinch of salt, knowing that this isn't a product that I've gone out and paid for. When I went to BSC this year, this slider caught my eye because it is compact, it has everything built into a control panel on the right, so that means that all the controls are physically there, and it also has this panning mechanism built in. Now, rewinding way back to like 2014, 2015, I actually got a panning mechanism for the Kessler slider that I had, and it was sort of a contraption you attached on. It like had to go in between the tripod head and the base of the slider, and then it had a bar at the back. Worked in a very similar fashion to the way that this one works, but what I like about this is it's all built into the frame of the slider. Now some people, when they look at these different options on which slider you should get, will opt to have the most configurable, most flexible slider. Now that often means that you'll be going for something which has the option of extending, you know, with little extension poles, and you can just take it out to be whatever length you happen to need at that time. And for a long time, I was kind of wooed by that allure of being able to have, you know, a 10-foot track or an 8-foot track or a 2-foot track, whatever I needed for the shot. But what I did find was that it often didn't work as well as a dedicated slider did. You know, there were little bumps maybe between the joins. We never seemed to have the right length of track for the shoot, you know. It always ended up being a little bit longer than I wanted most of the time, and then you have to have more stands to hold the thing so it doesn't flop around. And also, because of that complication of it being a modular system with a separate motor for the panning and a separate motor to pull the slider backwards and forwards that all had to be Bluetooth connected to an app, and then you had to screw the bits together and make sure you had the right supports in the right places, I found that if I wasn't the one who was setting it up, if I wasn't the one who was doing all of the really finicky little details, then it wouldn't work right. Something would go wrong, it would be bumpy, the app wouldn't properly bond up, I'd have to give someone my phone because my phone was the one that was bonded to the two things. One of the batteries would be flat, and then it wouldn't charge up quick enough for us to be able to use it without having tons of cables attached. So the idea that this slider isn't modular seems like a downside, but when I saw it I just went, that is what I want. I want something which doesn't have an external app connection, which is the only way to really viably control it. I want something where I can program in quick moves or give it to someone else to program in quick moves. It's super intuitive, and it doesn't take all of that learning curve, and also doesn't have all of the modular add-ons or extra motors. You know, it's not a panning motor here. It is a physical mechanical mechanism that can actually be adjusted in a very intuitive fashion. You're not trying to move things back and forth and synchronize two motors and all of that kind of stuff. In terms of what you get in the box, the slider comes in a case which is big enough for the slider. It has a couple of zippy pockets, so you can put any charging cables, you could put a couple of MPF batteries in there, you could put, I don't know, tripod head screws, anything that you need to get the slider going, as long as it's relatively small, will fit into that. Downside, you won't be able to fit a tripod head into that case as well, unless it is one of those tiny little ball heads that you can get that are more for like GoPros or very small lights, that kind of thing. Take you through the controls then. At the top, we've got the knob to control speed, so that goes from very slow to pretty darn quick, and I could just reach over and dial it up to full. We are now moving at full speed. And equally, I can dial it right down to a more sedate pace so that I can actually follow this without whipping my head backwards and forwards. Below that, we have the on-off button. So when you've got this set up with the battery on top, hit that on-off button, turn on the slider, and then if you press the play button, it will run a calibration where it moves from one side to the other so that the slider knows where the two endpoints are. That's really cool, actually, because in the early sliders that I had that were motorized, you didn't have that. You just had to stop before you reach the end, otherwise the motor would kind of go king, 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 and just jam up at the end, which never felt good and did happen. Like if you were on an interview shoot, the person who was operating that slider had to just constantly be going one way and then the other way and make sure they didn't hit the end, because otherwise it would make a really jarring sound which distracts everything and just kills the vibe. So this does it automatically, and it'll just move from side to side seamlessly once it is calibrated. Now at that point, you could just say, fine, that is it. I press play, I select the speed, it doesn't move from one side to the other and then back again and then stops. If you want to, you can set it up how I've got at the moment with the button that's just above the play and pause button, which allows you to select one cycle or a repeating ping-ponging move where it just goes backwards and forwards until you press pause again. Now, aside from that, you can also select A and B points, so move it to where you want your A point to be, move it to where you want the B point to be, and then between those two, the slider will just move. This is useful if you're doing a really precise product shot, for example. You don't need the whole length of the slider, so you don't want it to repeat the whole movement. Also, if you're doing an interview, it's useful if there's a bunch of junk in the corner and you don't want the slider to go all the way to the end because you start to see that and you don't want it to make it into the edit. So you just set those A and B points and then it'll just work between those 2 points. Very easy to do. Press once for A, move it to the next point, press once for B, and then press again, and it cancels the A and B points, and you're back to the full length of the slider. Super intuitive, and that's what I love about pieces of film equipment, when they can actually make something really, so you don't have to read the manual. You can just look at it, press the buttons a few times, and it just clicks and makes sense, and you have to constantly refer back to work out, you know, I've got to click this 10 times to do this, so I've got to click this 5 times, or I have to bond it up to a Bluetooth app and use a phone or an iPad or something to be able to control the settings. Now, aside from that, on the right-hand side, you have the 4 LED indicators to let you know what your battery level is at. You also, on the side, have a DC barrel input, so if you wanted to take a D-tap into this with a little DC plug on the end, you could do that, or you could mains power it. You can also update the firmware. You've got the USB-C port just there, and there is a 2.5mm jack, not a 3.5mm jack, which is for camera control. So that is something I'll get into a little bit later, one of the time-lapse features, and that allows you to control the camera with the slider, but I'll get into that in a moment. Now, aside from that control-wise, you also have the panning bar. So there is a little knurled thumb screw on the left and a little sort of wing nutty thing just in the mechanism on the right. And undoing those allows you to slide a little bar, a little track in the middle of the slider, which will then pivot the head of the little carriage around as it moves. Easiest way to get used to this is just have a little bit of play and see what it does. Obviously, it's something which you have to physically set. It's not an automatic setting. It's not something you program as such, but it's really easy to use. Just make sure you fasten them back down afterwards so that it doesn't stray. Now, I've been talking about this in terms of moving from side to side, but you can use it in a couple of other ways as well. So, for example, at the moment we've got everything focused in on my face and it's just pivoting to keep my face in the center of frame, but you can also have it so that it sort of does a more panoramic move, if you like, where it's starting looking very far one way and moving out looking very far the other way. So it's doing the outward version of this. You can also, of course, track in and out towards something, and you can even have the panning mechanism so it kind of pans, and as it moves in, it brings something into the center of frame. So there's a lot of ways that you can creatively pair up the the movement, whether it's forwards and backwards, side to side, with that panning mechanism as well. Now on top of all of this, the motor is actually powerful enough to allow it to do vertical or incline moves. Now that can give you a whole other spread of different looks that you can get. So for example, you can have the camera completely vertical, you can move up and down, treat it a little bit like a jib. You can also have it so that it pivots as it's doing at the moment, but in that vertical move, it's going to be keeping things in the center of frame as it looks down on them, levels off, and then starts to look up at them. Now that gets you into the realm where it almost feels like a motion control robot, like a Bolt or a Technocrane or something like that, on a smaller scale with a more limited payload, but you can get a sense of those kind of shots, which is really good for product work, and it can also be cool for like little B-roll shots, if you're doing a little documentary and you've got a bit of extra time. That kind of shot can really give something a bit more production value. Now it does start to step into the realm of things that you could do with a gimbal. But with a gimbal, it's never going to be quite as precise, and you've got the lateral shifts that you get with that as well. So yeah, I find that I'm more satisfied when I've taken the time to set up the frame on the slider than I would be if I was there for 5 minutes trying to get the perfect gimbal movement for the same shot. That said, the gimbal, if you're doing things on it already, it's going to be quicker. It's going to be a lot faster to get a load of different shots with that than it is to rig this up and get the shots looking perfect. But in some respects, the slider forcing you to do that forces you to think about the shots more. It forces you to be more careful with the framing. It forces you to really try to dress things, try to make this shot worthwhile. So in my experience, I think that I've tended to come out with a better shot because the slider's forcing me to take the time to make it a better shot. But that only works if you do have the time. So obviously, swings and roundabouts, basically it's a tool, and using that tool properly is always going to give you a very satisfying end result. If you're rushing with it, you probably won't be as satisfied. For leveling off the slider, we have these little kind of thumb screwy feet. Not a huge amount of range in the motion there, but enough that on an uneven surface you can get it leveled. The top of the slider itself has a very cool spring-loaded screw, so you can have a 1/4-20 or a 5/8 thread on that, so it will go into a normal tripod head. It'll also go directly onto a camera, so worst case scenario, you could screw your camera onto the top of this and it would work. You wouldn't have any pan or tilt, and you would have a more limited way of getting the shot set, but it would get you out of a sticky situation. On that note, if you are setting something up where, like I am just now, you have to be at about head height, you're probably going to need it on a tripod, and you're definitely going to require a sturdy tripod for this. As the camera moves from left to right, even with a relatively lightweight camera system that I've got just here, it will make the tripod, it's nothing to do with the slider particularly, it'll make the tripod just lean a little bit one way and then the other, just the play within the mechanisms and the screws and everything in the ball mount or whatever system you've got. So probably a heavy duty tripod, or you can get like little outrigger arms that are kind of a little bit like selfie sticks, to be honest. They can screw into either end of the tripod, and we do have mounting points for that. And then you can fasten them to the legs of the tripod, which just locks everything off and stops it from rocking. But definitely think about how you're going to rig this, because you don't want to get onto a shoot and have it tip over or have that nasty rocking backwards and forwards motion as you're doing your shot, and you don't notice it till you get to the edit because you're focused on other things. So yeah, have a bit of a play with the tripods that you've got and just make sure it's going to work for that. Now, I've used this on a number of different shoots over the past month and a half, just going out, shooting some time lapse, took around London, had a lot of fun with it. It's pretty basic stuff, and I'm not saying these are the best time lapses in the world, but it was quick and easy to use, and I could carry it around, not really worry about it. That was great. Now, I've also used it to do some product shots which are verging on the macro. Now, that is particularly demanding for sliders, because if there's any jitter in them at all, if the mechanism is a little bit jittery, if there are any little bumps, if the panning movement isn't entirely smooth, you'll really notice it in those macro shots. On a wider shot like this, I'm at 35 on a full frame camera, then you're probably not going to notice jitters as much, although, you know, you still would see it if you really looked. Now, the time lapses that I did in London are not the... We're going to get a little bit technical on time lapse now. They're not the best way of doing a time lapse on a slider. To be honest, the way that I prefer to do it gets a little bit more involved, and we actually do. I've been talking about not having an app and not using an app and all of that. We do have an app for this slider, so you can connect via Bluetooth, and actually, to be honest, this has been very painless. First time I've tried to connect it, every time it has just bonded up. There's been no challenges, no, you know, like Bluetooth resetting things, anything like that. It is just connected, which, you know, in terms of apps, that's really the bare minimum you should be expecting, but it's done that. It's been great. So if you don't use the app, you could just dial the speed down to the absolute minimum with that little control knob, and then let it run and just take your photos. Now, the downside of doing that is that you can only go to a certain speed. You can't go slower than the slowest move from side to side. Now, for a time lapse, that isn't really that slow. And also, it's going to be moving constantly. Now, that stylistically can be an interesting thing, because you will have, if you're dragging the shutter and doing a long exposure, which also is something that I aesthetically tend to prefer in time lapses, then you're going to end up with some motion blur of the movement of the slider in all of your shots, depending on how long you're dragging the shutter. Obviously, if it's a 30-second shutter, you're going to get some pronounced motion blur. If it's just half a second, it'll be there, but you probably won't really notice it. Stylistically, actually, it can be quite a nice thing, because it gives a sense of movement to things, and yeah, it's not so bad. But the downside is you can only make the time lapse last a certain length of time. You can't do a really long, like hours long time lapse, because the slider will complete its move even at the slowest pace in a few minutes. To do a slower move, you have to go into the app, go into time lapse mode, and then tell the slider basically how long you want this time lapse to last, how long you want it to take to travel from one side to the other, and how many shots you want it to take while it's doing that. If you are doing this and you're saying, okay, move, and it's going to stop, and then it's going to wait until it needs to move again, and it's just going along in those discrete steps. If you're just setting the camera to do photos every 5 seconds, at some points that camera is going to be moving whilst it's taking the photo, and other points it might not be. It really depends on how well your settings marry up. So that's going to result in an uneven spread of whether it's moving or whether it's still, whether the camera's taking a photo, whether it's not. They can't talk to each other. But it is possible with a little cable to connect the slider to the camera and use the slider to trigger the camera. So it will only trigger it when it is static. And this is what we call, in motion control time-lapse world, a move, shoot, move time-lapse. And that's cool because it deals with all of the technicalities of that. And you just need to set your camera to the exposure that you want and make sure that your exposure is allowing enough time between the moves and the shoots and that kind of thing for it to write to the card. So by doing that, you get a perfect time lapse with perfect motion, and you can make it as long or as short as you want. So for example, at the extreme end, you could do astro time lapse. You could have a time lapse where the shutter speed is 15 seconds or 30 seconds, and it's moving and shooting and moving and shooting around that. So you get your smooth moving motion in the foreground, and you get the lovely motion of the stars going over in the background, and that could be super, super impressive. But I'm getting too into the technicality of time-lapse things. Basically, this slider with the app, and you need the app to dial in all of those really technical, advanced settings, it will allow you to do quite a lot with the time-lapse speed. At the moment, I'm sitting really quite close to this camera, and I can't detect the volume of that motor moving at all. I can hear a couple of little fans from lights and things going in this room, and it's not a perfectly acoustically treated room, so you know there's a bit of reverberation, there's external noises. This is not contributing in any meaningful way. If I dial up the speed, then we will start, in fact I'll just reach and do this. So I'm going to take it to the maximum speed, which I'm going to have to really start looking where the camera is now. I can hear that, but I doubt very much that it's going to come out on the microphone. I'm going to be quiet for a minute and you'll hear a fan of a light. Yeah, so at the maximum speed, you can hear some mechanical noise of the thing moving backwards and forwards, but it isn't super pronounced. I've also got this very close to me, so if you were to use this at this speed, which is pretty fast, for an interview with someone, you're probably going to be a little bit further away than I am at the moment for this. And I think that in real terms, I wouldn't be concerned at all about the volume. Historically, when I was using sliders for interviews, I would usually have this off to the side and just have it as a long lens shot without the talent actually looking at the camera. Generally, I found that people have a hard enough time keeping their eyes on the lens of a camera anyway. So unless they are super confident, I don't think that it's worth trying to put them through that unless they really, really want this particular look for it. But I would be going more with having it off to the side. This on a 35mm and I'm on full frame, so I'd be going up to like 50, 75, 85, something like that off to the side. And then it's going to give you a really nice pronounced movement. Best to have a little bit of a play, get a friend to sit there. It's very hard to set this up yourself. I had to get my wife to come down and sit in to make sure that I was tracking this perfectly in, because you can imagine fiddling with something, coming and sitting back down, looking it on the side. It's just really, really finicky to get it dialed in. So yeah, get someone to come in and sit for you. Another downside, when you are doing this kind of thing, it becomes a harder shot to edit. Now, I have been dressing in plenty of B-roll, hopefully, I'm assuming so, because at any point when I want to make a cut, like I'm going to scratch my nose now, if I wanted to cut that, I would have to put something over the top of it, or there would be a jump of movement. So even if I could punch in or something, the background shifts. So it does make it a little bit more prescriptive in the edit as to how you're going to use these shots. So again, like I say, if I had this as a B-roll shot off to the side, long lens, and then I had a wider shot that I could cut to as well, then it's just a little bit safer. And in fact, on interviews and documentaries where I've used sliders for movement in the past for interviews, I've actually had 3 cameras rolling so that we had plenty of options for how we were making it play. Additionally, you might find that you're cutting between 2 sections of interview, and in one section, the person was talking and the camera's moving this way. And then you want to cut to a bit that they're saying a little bit later on, and suddenly the camera's moving back in the opposite direction. Now that can get a little bit distracting, and it can make things feel a little bit weird, especially if you're cutting between different people, and then the interviews have a direction to them. And that means that the shot that you're cutting over as B-roll may jar with it. So there's a bunch of stuff which isn't the fault of this slider at all. It's just the nature of using these things. You're going to have to get used to how it actually fits into your workflows in that sense, as well as whether you like the movement, whether the movement is at the right speed, if the background is dressed enough, because as you've probably seen, we're seeing a lot more background than we would do if this was just a static shot, because the camera's actually getting a chance to have a little bit of a look around the room and see more of it. So even on a longer lens, suddenly you're having to dress more background, and especially if you're having it off to the side, well, there's tons of stuff over this side that maybe I don't want you to see, and it's going to see all of it. So there's lots of little kind of particular things that you're going to have to get used to. Would I recommend this motion control slider? In terms of pricing, for the Toprig S60, we're looking at a US price of $399. Now, I have seen that cheaper, but that seems to be the official retail price. And in the UK, that is going for £374.99, including VAT. For the Toprig S40, if you wanted to make the comparison to the shorter slider, in the US, we are looking at $349, and in the UK, we are looking at £328.99, including VAT again. And that leads to the question again, at that price, is it worth investing into one of these slider systems? And I think that my answer is 100% yes. Just think about what you're going to do with it. Are you going to use it for interviews? Are you going to use it for motion control time-lapse? Are you in the world where actually this really appeals to you because you'd like some really precise product shots, and that's more what you do? I think all of those applications this will excel at. Absolutely, positively yes. This is the most fun I've had with a slider in a decade or more. If you have any questions at all, drop them down below. I'll be happy to jump into the comments and give any answers to things that I haven't covered in this video. And if you found this review informative, don't forget to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel, because we will have more of these coming out soon.